Thank you for this opportunity. I love this group. I love learning with you and going on this journey through Daf Yomi together. I see some of our Dafers in this group, and maybe I'll see some of you tonight as well as we go through a full shiur of the Daf as well. What a week we've had in Masechet Sukkah and Tractate Sukkah. We explored a number of issues, but actually, when we take a step back and think about the daf that we've done this week, we emerge with a tremendous amount of practical halacha, practical law relating to how to build our sukkahs, what our sukkah should be made out of, the concept of ta'asa, v'lo min ha'asui, which means you gotta make your sukkah and it can't be pre-made. There's a lot of anxiety about that actually on our daf, that you not walk into a sukkah where nothing has been done explicitly to create a sukkah out of it. A sukkah for the sake of Sukkot, to build, to create shade, that's going to be a major theme. I also want to just ask everyone to step back for a second. Raise your hand if you're good at putting together furniture. Is anyone good at that? Maybe? Okay, there's like 4 of you. I guess some of us, our strength is in the daf. But if you imagine picking up an IKEA catalog and actually mining it for spiritual significance, right? That's what this is. So it's important to go on this pendulum while you're learning Masechet Sukkah to be like, okay, here's the halacha for how to build a sukkah that's proper and actually has all of the proper halachic requirements. But now we have to take a step to the side, a step back and be like, oh, wow, that's a really significant halachic thing, spiritual thing that just emerged from that page 2 of the IKEA catalog, right? As it were. Who knew that IKEA would make it into the Daf Yomi? Now, one of those concepts we saw on Daf 10, 11, that concept around bundling, actually. This Eged, which is also the name of the bus company of Israel, right? We could think about why that is. There's probably historical reasons there. But Eged means to bundle together or create a bundle. With schach, with your covering on your sukkah, that igud, that bundling together is actually really problematic. You cannot have a bundled together object on the top of your sukkah. But when it comes to the arba minim, the 4 species that you're going to shake in the sukkah, we're going to learn about that. We haven't arrived yet there, but here we learned on Daf 11 that you must bundle them together. And we explored the concept of what does it mean to bundle a thing together, to gather together. And the word eged, aguda, also is a representation of Jewish unity. When you look at some of our liturgy, it says that in a high holiday liturgy, we become an aguda achat, right? We want to be one unity, one unit that actually comes together with all our diverse parts. And the reason that's relevant is because we learn that a bundle is not a bundle if it does not have more than one species in it. So that means our Jewish communities are not necessarily communities, bundles, unless they are made up of different kinds of people, different kinds of species, which is very interesting and fabulous. I want to hop forward with you to Daf bottom of 11. Bottom of 11, we're hopping on to Daf 12. We learn a very important concept about schach, and we should be able to walk into any halachic cocktail trivia party, and someone can corner us with our drinks and say, hey, is this thing schach that's kosher or not? And we'll respond that we know because number 1, schach should be something that grows from the ground. Number 2, schach should be something that is not susceptible to ritual impurity. It's not like a vessel that's complete. You can't use something that is, we've been talking about pitchforks yesterday. You can't use a pitchfork, a schach. It's a vessel. And by the way, I'm sorry, just interrupting myself. Please throw anything you'd like in the chat. You can put questions, comments, snarkiness, anything you want, just throw it in the chat. I would love to have you participate as we go through some of this information. Okay, so it has to be something that grows from the ground and something that is impervious to ritual impurity. Hey, thanks, Julie. So what does this mean? We explored the reason why schach needs to have these qualities. And this I found was the most striking part of our daf this week. If you're interested in following along, we're on the bottom of 11b, but I'm going to say it outside too. Because we have this question. you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction to, okay, schach is something that is detached from the ground, but grows from the ground, and is not susceptible to ritual impurity. Why? Why is that? Well, we learned 3 possible reasons why that is. Number 1 is we have a beautiful proof that the clouds and the mist at the beginning of the creation of the earth are the representation of our schach. They symbolize our schach. And just like mist comes up from the earth, so too our schach must grow from the earth and be impervious to ritual impurity. Wow. This is a proof I had never heard before learning the daf, right? That actually our schach, what represents it is the original mist and condensation of the universe. It's very cool. So that was proof number 1. Proof number 2, that schach should grow from the ground and be impervious to tuma is really interesting. It's that the sukkah itself is like and just like animals grow from the ground and are impervious to ritual impurity when they are alive. When they're dead, they do get all different kinds of impurity, which we've talked about before. So too, our sukkah, our schach, needs to be something that grows from the ground and does not have ritual impurity. Now, someone's going to raise their hand and say, what are you talking about? An animal doesn't grow from the ground. I've never seen a goat tree, right? So there's a whole debate in the commentaries about how it's not actually that the animals grow from the ground, but they're sustained by something that from the ground. So that was the second approach. That's very different, right? If our sukkah is the original mist of the universe or a korban, a sacrifice, that's a very different way to relate to your sukkah. Those are 2 very different things. And actually, the third approach is the one we stick with, and that ends up on dot 12. That's when we look at a scriptural proof that we celebrate the harvest festival. Very straightforward proof. Just like the harvest festival, we learn that you celebrate with the refuse of the threshing floor and the wine press. So too, that's what should be on top of your sukkah. By the way, what does sukkah mean? The word sukkah means covering, right? So sukkah and schach are directly related. So when you talk about what makes a kosher sukkah, what we're really asking is what makes a kosher schach, right? What makes a kosher overhang for your sukkah? The walls are relevant, but less relevant, actually. If you have, we learned this on Daf 8 or 9, that if you have a sukkah whose walls are up all year, even a sukkah, made for shade for animals or something, if you come along and adjust the schach on it, even to the point of moving it a tefach or 2, that is kosher for your sukkah, even if the structure is up the whole year. Raise your hand if you have a sukkah whose structure is up the whole year at your house, the place you live. Yeah, so there are some people here who have that situation. Exactly. All right, any questions? Throw them into the chat. I want to make sure that we are covering the pieces of this week's stuff that are relevant to you, that you're thinking about. Pepita asked me in a message, what is the handle of the grain? So this was a really interesting last couple of days. What we were talking about is that a food item can be susceptible to ritual impurity, and it can get spiritual cooties, as it were. Is that irreverent to say? Maybe it is. I don't know, but I did it because no one will forget. So food can get ritual impurity, but there's a debate about whether or not the, quote, handle of the food also gets ritual impurity. So that means the banana gets ritually impure, but the banana peel depends. It depends why you're picking up the banana. If you're using the banana simply to eat, then the peel would get ritual impurity because you want the peel. You want to hold it with the peel. That's a relevant thing for you. If you're using the banana to be a paperweight, maybe the peel wouldn't be all that relevant and wouldn't be susceptible to ritual impurity. Okay, looking in the chat, the question, I'm amazed the details how important intention is in building a sukkah. However, my understanding is that building a sukkah is not necessarily a mitzvah. Yeah, what an interesting thing, right? Intention, as you can see, is only a little relevant when it comes to a sukkah. And we learned on Daf 8 that you can walk into a sukkah that's built for another reason totally, or even by non-Jews or or by women, right? So we talk about people who are not obligated in Sukkah building the Sukkah, and actually creating the Sukkah is not in essence the point of the mitzvah. It's sitting and living in the Sukkah, and someone else can build it for you. It has to be built for the purpose of Sukkot, for the purpose of shade, but intention for the building of the Sukkah is actually just the act of creating a hechsher shel mitzvah, a hefzer shel mitzvah. You're making the thing that allows you to do the mitzvah, but it is not the mitzvah itself. So how do we relate to mitzvot that are not the mitzvah itself, but are preparatory actions? There's actually a big debate. I don't know why I'm going here. There's a big debate about fertility, like having children, and is perhaps for women. Women are not obligated in the mitzvah of fertility, which is really interesting because it's dangerous. You can't be obligated in a mitzvah that is dangerous for you, but they are obligated in raising children and educating them. So actually the act of birthing and fertility is a preparatory mitzvah act for women, which is very interesting. Okay. So Jennifer asked me, so is the handling the covering of the fruit or the grain? It depends. It depends on that particular object. I don't know if people are direct messaging me because that's the default, right? Maybe that's the default. Oh, no. Okay, cool. Someone asked me about how ugly should your sukkah be? Does it have to be ugly? And should it resemble hardship and suffering? Oh, what a good question. What do you think? I mean, does a sukkah have to be ugly? Actually, I would say the opposite. We saw in the last 5 days or so that there's a prohibition against using certain that will cause you to leave your sukkah, right? That's something that's and will drop thorns on you. It smells bad. If those things cause you to not want to be there, right? That's bad. You cannot have a sukkah whose schach or whose appearance would make you want to leave. And at the same time, it needs to be a temporary structure, a temporary dwelling. That brings me actually to yesterday's stuff, an important concept. We learn of the prohibition against building a sukkah with schach that looks too much like a roof. That's called gezerat tikra, the decree of the roof, right? So you don't want to use a building material for your schach, even if it's totally kosher, that kind of resembles something you would use as roofing. And we saw a story on yesterday's daf about a group of rabbis who were living during a time of danger. And even though it was okay technically to use boards that are, grow from the ground, right? They're trees, and they are not susceptible to ritual impurity. One really shouldn't use boards that look too much like construction materials, but they did because they had to go under the radar that they were sitting in a sukkah, right? So in general, this is where of bamboo mats come in. So if anyone is ever confused about are bamboo mats okay for my sukkah, you just learned a week of Daf Yomi that will really help you answer that question. One of those things to think about is gezerat tikra, right? It doesn't look too much like a roof. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen any house that actually has a roof of a bamboo mat, right? That's not something I'm going to mistake for a stable construction material. So that's one leniency that's applied to bamboo mats. Another possible any other that they consider with a schach mat. Did I freeze?
You froze for a second. Can you just repeat the last sentence?
Yes. Keep you on your toes. Put in the chat any other reason that you think bamboo mats might be an issue from what we've learned in the daf this week. What might be an issue with a bamboo mat? What do you think? So one thing is gezerat tikra. It might resemble a construction material. Okay, so someone chatted me, they are bundled together. That could be, except on this week's daf, we learned that one item or species bundled together is not really a bundle, right? They're tied. And so therefore, yeah, we're getting there. We're warmer. What it is that possibly the mat is susceptible to ritual impurity, right? And another way to say that is it's a finished thing, right? It's an object. Usually schach is something that is trash, right? Refuse, agricultural refuse. It's not susceptible to ritual impurity. And so here we're dealing with a case where is this sheet really susceptible to ritual impurity. And one leniency is that actually it's just tied together because it's easier to carry, right? It's not like it's an object that people need to use as an object. It's just that they're tied together because it's easier to carry. The last issue we don't really talk about explicitly, but I'll share it. It's called ma'amid. I'm just going to put it in chat. That means it's there's something that's bringing together or supporting your schach material that is makabel tuma, that is susceptible to ritual impurity, right? So you might have some inappropriate schach material tying your bamboo together. And so there's a stringency to actually not use that for your schach material, but there are ways to adjust by making sure your bamboo mats are supported by other kosher schach, like 2x4s or something like that. So congratulations, you just went into a really, really complex halachic issue from 1 week of the daf. Very cool. Okay, so Janine asks, was it or is it okay to make the sukkah something under the radar? What a good question, and one that really asks a greater question, which is there a sense of hidur mitzvah, of a beautification of the mitzvah in putting your sukkah like out loud and proud, right? Like to have it be like really prominently a sukkah. And I don't know the answer to that, right? It seems like intention is really the issue here. But that's an interesting thing. There's this sense that hiding it was not the ideal place that they wanted to be, right? Good question. Very good. What else? Any other questions? See some community building in South Dakota, which is awesome. That's SD, right? SD. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's San Diego.
Oh, way to go, Das. All right. Very cool. What other questions came up for you on the daf? I can keep hitting you with some cool information while we're going. So yesterday's daf, we talked about the minimum amount, or maximum amount rather, of invalid schach that you can have on your sukkah, and your sukkah can still be valid. Remember this? So we talked about, let's say you have a 4 tefach board, which is bad because why? Too much like a construction material, gezerat tikra. If you have a 4 tefach board in your sukkah, right in the middle, you got an issue, right? 4 tefachim of non-kosher schach in the middle of your sukkah, you've got an issue. If it's on the side of the sukkah, you actually have much more space to maneuver, as we talked about yesterday. You have up to 4 amos of space, actually, to have in valid schach. And we'll talk more about that as well. Okay, what else? Other questions? So Janine, if hiding it or making it less noticeable was done because of the danger, was, yeah, it was okay. And yesterday's stuff, we learned, okay, so isn't that, since it was okay, shouldn't we all be doing it? Right? And the answer was no, we don't make a decree from times of danger. Well, welcome to the year after COVID-19, when many different communities who are, or we're still in it, but we're the year after like the height of it. And so many communities asked a question, if we made halachic adjustments during a time of danger, do we keep them or do we revert? Right? That was really that discussion that came up on this week's daf. On yesterday's daf, we also had a beautiful homiletic teaching about a pitchfork. Anyone remember this? Thumbs up. Okay, so we learned that the word for pitchfork, which is, I'm just putting in the chat, eter, see how fast I can type in Hebrew here, ayin, tough, reish, that is the word for pitchfork. It's also the word used for prayer. In the story in the book of Genesis, where Isaac is praying with/for Rebecca during their time of davening for a child. And we learned on yesterday's daf that this word for pitchfork and prayer are directly related. Why? Because just as a pitchfork, its job is to like turn over your grain, like turn it over and over and over again. So too, that's the purpose of prayer. We're trying to turn over God's decrees over and over and over again. Beautiful idea. And last night in our Daf Yomi, talking about like, that's a unique prayer energy. I've never really thought about that before. Prayer as agricultural, consistent work of kind of productivity, right? Like turning over the grain over and over and over again. That was a beautiful teaching on yesterday's daf. Other questions that have come up about sukkah structure, schach, goats, right? You got to have a Daf Yomi with a goat. Otherwise, what's the purpose? You know, there has to be a goat in every Masechta. Norman, did you have a question? No. Okay, sorry. Any questions? You can put it in the chat, comments, things you found interesting. I'm going to just keep hunting here because things are really cool in this week's Daf. Remember the part about the sukkah within a sukkah, right? That's an issue. If you sleep in your sukkah under a 4-poster bed, that was an issue. And there was a whole discussion about whether or not that 4-poster bed or that triangle bed in your sukkah constituted a separate space or not. And there was a chuckle-worthy section about if a person is in the nude and wanting to say Shema, if they stick their head out of that sukkah, out of that bed, that canopy bed, are they out in a different space now or not, right? Because if they're out in a different space, they can pop their head out and say the Shema. If they're not in a different space, then it's as if they're just in the nude, in the larger sukkah. That was a little interesting way to explore that question. You imagine kind of the Rabbanan, the rabbis, maybe getting a little bit of a chuckle out of that instance. Okay, so I got a question about walls and little goats. So right at the end of yesterday's daf, we learned that a wall is not a wall if a little baby goat can get through the bottom. So, you know, we should coin that as a phrase that should be used, you know, on the regular. A wall is not a wall if a baby goat can get through the bottom. But it's actually a really important halachic concept. It's called gedim bokenbo. Little goats can get through. Now, if little goats can get through, you've got a wall problem. It's not serving a function of a wall anymore. We're going to talk a lot more about walls this coming week. So we just kind of began that discussion there. But the way that actually looks is a certain number of tfachim from the bottom of the wall. If there's a breach, that ruins the wallability of your sukkah. Anyone here learn Eruvin back in Eruvin? Okay, so I see some hands. You'll see a lot of parallels between that Masechta, that tractate, and this one. You've got really two major discussions, two tractates about creating physical space, right? Walls, doorways, ceilings, how to create different domains. That really becomes relevant. I don't have time to go into this in depth, but really fascinating. Right at the beginning of this week's daf, there was a little bit of a confusing situation about if a sukkah works for Sukkahs, but its walls aren't enough for the Eruv. Remember this? So there's like different halachic minimums for a wall for Sukkahs and for an Eruv, and they're not necessarily the same. So we had an interesting discussion back on Daf 7 about whether or not you could carry from your house into the Sukkah on Shabbos, right? If there's no Eruv out where you are. And the answer was, if it's during Sukkahs, yes. If it's not during Sukkahs, no. Because if it's during Sukkahs, your sukkah is providing the halachic walls for a separate domain. But if it's not really a wall for the case of Eruvins. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, looking at the chat here, can one wall of the sukkah be permanent? Absolutely, one wall of the sukkah can be permanent, and we'll have lots more opportunities to talk wall in the coming week. So get excited for that. I live in a city where there are a lot of different alleyways and existing walls, and for many different locations here in South Philadelphia, you throw a piece of schach on the top of where you are, and it's a sukkah, right? That's definitely possible. Okay. Yes, we have some questions about Eruvin, right? Back in that area of the daf where I was referring to, there is a debate about which one is more stringent when it comes to walls, sukkah or Eruv. And as I can see here in Michelin's comments, there are some ways in which an Eruv is much more lenient, and there are others in which it's much more stringent. So that will come up as well. Okay. So also a question about Beit Shammai versus Beit Hillel. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but there is a major thing that happens in our tractate, which is that we rule like Beit Shammai, which we do not usually do, about the minimum size of a sukkah. Beit Shammai comes along and requires a smaller minimum than Beit Hillel. and we rule that way, which is interesting. Okay, so intrigued by the concept of the instructions given by God for building the Mishkan. Oh yeah, that's really interesting, Mary Jane. So just for everyone who's not looking at the chat, there's all these vibes of crossover episodes between building of the Mishkan and building of the Sukkah. You saw some today, right? We got this idea that, okay, the Sukkah is a korban, a sacrifice. We also saw on last week's daf, I wonder if the class reviewed it, are we sitting in the ark, right, of the Mishkan? Are we sitting in the wingspan underneath the cherubs, right? All of these references to the Mishkan in our sukkahs. And I think, Mary Jane, if we take a step back, you're making a really excellent comment about what the rabbis are trying to do here in terms of sanctifying our sukkahs as little mini temples that we can build, right? Replicating some of that detail and some of that rigor. That's a great question, great comment. All right, Julie, I see we're getting to the end here. Anything we want to cover before we stop?
Someone had asked a bit earlier about the plaster that's mentioned in today's daf.
The plaster on today's daf. I haven't taught today's daf yet, so I have to actually get there. Give me a second. What's the question? Question was about removing plaster. Was that it?
I don't know if it was that specific.
Just in general.
Yeah. Oh,
okay.
More on today's daf, please, about taking away plaster.
Okay. So without having prepared today's daf, the issue of plaster comes up in the Mishnah connected to construction materials, right? So if you've got plaster on your schach, what am I going to do? I'm going to look at it and be like, oh, cool, a permanent house, right? So when the daf talks about removing plaster, what it's talking about is you trying to make an adjustment to turn your dwelling slightly more temporary, right? You want to indicate the temporal nature of your sukkah. And I don't know, maybe people are starting to feel this. It's like we're on this crazy line right between permanence and temporariness. Like we're right on that line. It actually can't be too much of either. And that's a question to think about too, as we explore the theology of our IKEA catalog. Why is that, right? What are we trying to indicate? Also on today's daf, or yesterday's daf, apologies, there was a very famous and important debate about what our sukkahs represent. Was it the actual huts that we sat in the desert? Or was it the clouds of glory? The ananea kavod that gave us shade in the wilderness. Those are two very different things. And that's going to come up again in our tractate as well. Okay, yes. So good question about a sukkah on top of a sukkah. Is that even logistically possible? Well, on the daf that we just explored that on, I do think that was on this week's daf. Maybe it was pre-Tisha B'Av, so maybe not. But we said that if it's not really possible or inhabitable, it's not really a sukkah on top of a sukkah, right? We went through a number of cases where you could have a sukkah on top of a sukkah and your bottom sukkah would be kosher because nobody's going to be up there, right? And so really what you're dealing with is an issue of double schach, and then you have to correct for that, right? But it's a great point. The flimsy nature would possibly make your sukkah on top of a sukkah question irrelevant.